After escaping a toxic relationship with his parents, he finds a new path filled with a search for inner peace and true freedom. He started participating in school projects, discovered a love for music. And one day, when he was asked to give a speech in history class, he told his story not directly, without details, but sincerely. And when he finished, the class was silent. Not because they didn't care, but because everyone felt something at that moment. Trevor was already 17 when he found out that his mother had gone to rehab. His father had disappeared, gone somewhere, leaving behind only debts. His mother sent a letter. It had many apologies, but most importantly, she wrote that she wanted to change. Trevor didn't respond right away. He kept the letter in a drawer for a long time, rereading it from time to time. And then he wrote. Briefly. He made no promises, made no plans. He simply wished her strength. He knew that he didn't have to go back to that life. But he also knew that a heart is lighter when it is free of hatred. After graduating from high school, he applied to several colleges. He was accepted into the creative writing program at the University of Minnesota. He packed his things, hugged his adoptive parents, who had become more than just shelter for him, and he drove away. Looking out the bus window, leaving behind everything that had begun his journey. Life did not become easy. But it became real. And Trevor learned that the hardest thing was not to run away, but to leave in the past what was dragging him down. And every time he wrote another story, he put a part of himself into it, the boy who left home with an old backpack and a new hope. That same day, he met Mrs. Woods in the library. She had grown older, but her gaze remained the same. She recognized him immediately. They exchanged a few words, and Trevor thought she was proud of him, even though she didn't say it out loud. And he realized how important it was to have at least one adult who believed in him. Back at university, he wrote another story, this time about a woman who always held the door open, even when everyone else was closing it. And that was him. And her. And everyone who had ever tried to break through something that seemed impossible. Trevor wasn't famous. His books didn't sell millions of copies. But he wrote. And every word he said was real. And every story was another brick in the building he had been building since the moment he left home with an old backpack on his back. And maybe that was the point of it all, not forgetting who you were, but allowing yourself to become someone new. Without fear. Without pain. And with a hope that was no longer fragile. That fall evening, as the city slowly lit up and the air grew cool and clear, Trevor sat on a bench in the campus courtyard and watched the students hurry off to their evening classes. He had a new notebook in his hands, but the pages remained blank. For the first time in a long time, he took his time writing. He simply allowed himself to feel the silence, the peace, the slight anxiety that no longer felt like a sentence. It was in that silence that a thought came to him, simple and clear. He no longer wanted to live just for himself. His words could be more than just therapy. They could be a thread for those who still wandered in the darkness. Those who had no place to hide. Those who, like him, had buried their shame under the covers and were afraid to admit that they needed help. With that thought in mind, he began to look for opportunities. He turned to the curators, to the organizations that worked with teenagers in difficult families. Not as an expert, but as someone who knows from the inside, who has seen the darkness and found the strength to get out of it. He was invited to speak to a group of teenagers who lived in a temporary shelter. Trevor hesitated. He was not used to talking about himself out loud. But this time it was more important than shame. In a small room where the walls were painted a calm green and the windows looked out onto an empty courtyard, Trevor spoke simply. Without pathos. Without embellishment. He told how he was afraid of the evenings. How he went nowhere. How he wrote at night so as not to scream. He did not look for pity. He simply left his story in the air as proof that there is a way out. When he finished, the room was silent. And then one of the girls looked up and said that she had also run away once. And that this was the first time she felt someone understood her. And that was enough. Because sometimes all it takes is one person to say, "I've been there." From that evening on, everything changed. Trevor began to write differently. His stories remained literary, but they became a little more open, a little warmer. They had characters who broke circles, who sought new routes. He no longer hid the past, he wove it into his life. Like a pattern in a fabric. Not as a burden, but as a proof of strength. He started a small online blog. There were no ads, no loud headlines, no clickbait. Just words. Stories. Reflections. In the comments, those who had never spoken out loud about their own wrote. They wrote, "This feels like me." They wrote, "I thought I was alone." And this became a support not only for them, but also for himself. He was no longer alone. A year later, Trevor was invited to give a series of lectures at the school where he had once studied. He could not help but smile when he received the letter. The past he had fought for so long was returning not as an enemy but as an opportunity. He laughed. He walked through familiar hallways where everything seemed smaller than he remembered. He saw Mrs. Woods, who hugged him like a son. And when he spoke to his students, he didn't talk about pain. He talked about choice. That you could always leave a room when it was dark. Life was still not easy. Sometimes the nightly memories would come. Sometimes the longing for what he had never had, a real family, warmth, stability, would flood in. But Trevor had learned not to run away. He allowed himself to feel. And he wrote. He wrote, even when it was hard. Because he knew that somewhere, among hundreds or thousands of people, someone was reading these words right now, holding on to them like a lifeline. One rainy day, he received a short letter from his father. He wrote that he had tried to quit. That it didn't always work out. That he read his blog. That he didn't ask for anything. He just wanted his son to know that he was proud. It wasn't forgiveness. And it wasn't reconciliation. But there was no lie in those words. And Trevor understood, this was also part of the journey. Accepting without turning back. At 23, he published his first collection. A small publication, modest, without loud advertising. But it became a home for his stories. And every page was written with sincerity. With light. Even where it was dark. And every time someone wrote to him that this book had helped, Trevor remembered that boy with the backpack. And the quiet voice inside him that had once whispered, "Don't give up." And now he knew for sure that life doesn't have to be perfect to be valuable. And the past doesn't have to be beautiful to become the basis for something new. And most importantly, pain, lived to the end, can become not only a scar, but a wing. The seasons passed, each leaving its mark on the pages of his diary, snow on the window. Golden leaves on the sidewalks, dawns over a city that no longer seemed alien. Trevor lived. Simply, but deeply. And each day was not only a new step, but also a new layer on the map of his own strength. He no longer fought memories, did not reject them, he learned to look at them as a part of himself. Not with pain, but with peace. One summer morning, when the sky was clear and the air smelled fresh, he woke up with a feeling that something was changing. Not sharply, not loudly, like a shift in the wind, which you notice only when the leaves on the trees begin to rustle differently. In this new peace, there was a place for dreams. Not escape, dreams. And for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to wonder, what next? His collection was read in several school districts. Teachers began using excerpts in literature classes to talk to teenagers about the power of words and the possibility of change. Several teachers wrote to him, thanking him for the truth. And then one of the charitable foundations invited him to create a series of short stories for a program that worked with children in crisis families. He agreed without hesitation, because he knew that these were not just stories. They were doors that someone was looking for in the dark. He wrote in coffee shops, on benches, in the library, where he had been hiding from home since his youth. He was no longer ashamed of his path. He was no longer afraid of silence. And when one day a boy, about 15, approached him and said that he had read his stories and decided to sign up for drawing classes, Trevor just smiled. Because he understood, every small action matters. Life didn't get louder, but it got deeper. There were no fireworks, but there were lights in the windows of the houses he passed on his way home. There were strangers who shared stories with him in letters. There were words that came to him in the middle of the night, like friends who don't let you forget who you are. And one day he met Selena. She was a volunteer at the same foundation. Her story was different pain, different shadows, but she also knew what it was like when home hurt more than it healed. They took their time. They just talked. About books. About movies. About childhood memories hidden behind dense silence. Meeting after meeting, they began to open up to each other, not as a rescue, but as a space in which there was no need to hide. Selena showed him that closeness is not a danger. It is not a trap. It is something that can be gentle, even if you are afraid of touch. She did not demand anything, but was there. And when, one rainy evening, he said out loud for the first time that he did not remember a single day from his childhood when he felt safe, she simply took his hand. And he realized that he was no longer alone. Together they began working on a new project, a series of visual stories that combined Trevor's words with illustrations by children who had experienced difficult families. It was a tender, real work, for the sake of those who were just beginning their journey. And one evening, when the windows in their apartment were painted with rain and the world seemed especially quiet, Trevor thought that maybe this is what healing looks like. Not loudly, not brightly, but quietly, step by step. When you allow yourself to be, and allow others to be there. His past remained with him, not like a stone, but like roots. Deep. Alive. Something that wouldn't let him fall, even when the winds got strong. And what was amazing was that he didn't want to forget anymore. Because there was strength in those scars. There was meaning in those memories. Now he often returned to that first day he left home. And he understood, the real salvation began not when he ran away, but when he allowed himself to move forward, not looking back with hatred, but with understanding. Because life is not just an escape from darkness. It is a movement towards light. And even if this light appears slowly, it is real. And Trevor knew there are many more stories ahead. But now he will not write them out of loneliness. He will write them out of love. Several years passed. His name was no longer just a signature under short stories in local publications, it became a sign of sincerity, openness, pain that found a voice. People wrote To him not only because they wanted to thank him, they were looking for themselves in his words. And they found them. He read these letters slowly, carefully, sometimes several times. Each of them was like a mirror, different stories, but with the same cracks inside. Another tradition emerged in his life. Once a year, he held an open meeting in a small library in the south of the city. Those who grew up among empty bottles, suffocating silence, and shadows that did not disappear even in the light came there. He did not say much. He only read a new story aloud. And then he sat and listened. And the way those people began to speak, hesitantly, with a trembling voice, but with hope, was for him the greatest confirmation that pain can be not only a burden, but also a support for someone else. His parents still lived in the same house from which he left. And although he did not return for a long time, at a certain moment something changed inside him. Not the desire to forgive, and not the need, but some deep silence that whispered, it is no longer about them. It is about you. And that you no longer have to carry their pain as your own. He didn't come to the threshold of that house with expectations. He just walked past, stopped, looked at the windows. And for the first time he felt nothing, neither anger, nor longing, nor shame. Just peace. Like a page that had finally been turned. He turned around and went on into his life, in which there was a place not only for memory, but also for the future. In the evening, he sat on the roof of the house where he and Selina had lived for several months. A cup of cold tea stood nearby, in his hands a notebook, the pages of which smelled of ink and fresh thoughts. He was writing a new story, not about himself, but about a boy who dared to believe that he could be different. Not better. Just his own. The present. Below, the windows of apartments glowed, in which someone was cooking dinner, someone was arguing, someone was laughing. And this ordinariness was so valuable. Because Trevor knew that great achievements were not always necessary. Sometimes it was enough just not to break and move on. Selina went out onto the roof with a blanket and just sat down next to him. They were silent, listening to the city. Her presence was calm, like the touch of warmth on a cool day. There was more in that silence than 1,000 words, the understanding they had both been searching for so long, and which had finally become real. And as night fell on the city, Trevor thought that maybe happiness wasn't a place or a people. It was a state in which one no longer had to hide. And in which one was allowed to be vulnerable. Even when it still hurt. The story he was writing was supposed to end with the words, he didn't become a hero. He became himself. And that was enough. And with that last sentence written, Trevor closed his notebook and smiled at himself for the first time in a long time, not as someone who had run away, but as someone who had finally come home. Inside himself. The next morning, waking up before sunrise, Trevor lay in silence for a long time. The floor in the room creaked faintly, outside the window rare cars glided along the night street, and the air was still cool, fresh, almost spring-like. He felt an unusual lightness, not the kind that comes from joy, but the kind that arises when something inside finally falls into place. As if a piece of a puzzle that had been missing all his life had found its cell. That day he did not open his laptop. He did not write, did not edit, did not check his mail. He simply left the house without plans, without a route, without a goal. He walked the streets of the city, peering at people, their faces, movements, gestures. And suddenly he noticed, he no longer felt superfluous. He was not looking for somewhere to escape, he was already here. Present. Real. In a small park, where the trees cast long shadows on the still damp ground, he sat down on a bench. Next to him, an old man was feeding pigeons, a little girl was running around her mother with a balloon, and on the next bench, someone was reading a newspaper. Everything was so ordinary. And in this ordinariness he found peace. He took out an old notebook from his backpack, the same one that still had a few blank pages left. Instead of writing a new story, he started something completely different. He left a short note: life no longer presses. It breathes with me. Then he decided that these few pages should not be for him, but for someone else. For someone who, like him, would someday sit somewhere, looking inside himself, looking for at least a small thread to grab onto so as not to fall. He filled the pages with simple thoughts that pain is not a curse, that self-love is not selfishness, but salvation, that the past doesn't have to disappear to stop ruling, that being yourself is not weakness, but courage. When he finished writing, he simply left the notebook on the bench, with a roll of eraser around it, and walked away without looking back. Because from now on he didn't hold on to words. He shared them. Returning home, he hugged Selena without saying anything. And she, as always, understood everything without words. Their life was not cloudless, but it was real. And in this realness, in the daily chores, in the endless movement of ordinary days, they created something new, not only for themselves, but also for those who were still learning to find themselves in the world. Over time, Trevor became more than just a writer. He became the one they turned to when they wanted not an answer, but support. Not a solution, but presence. And every time someone said, "It seems to be about me," he nodded and replied, "Because I, too, was looking for myself in every line." And the notebooks on the benches became a tradition. Sometimes he left them in coffee shops, sometimes at bus stops. Some wrote their own stories there. Some simply took them home. But they all lived on as memories, as proof that even the darkest story can have a bright ending. And when one day in a bookstore he saw a girl standing with his book in her hands and reading the last page, he came closer and heard her whisper, he did not become a hero. He became himself. And that was enough. And Trevor smiled again, not like someone who had once run away, but like someone who knows every story has a meaning, if someone hears it. And if it is born not from fear, but from love. He did not start talking to her. He just stood a little to the side, watching her flip through the pages, stopping from time to time to reread individual lines, as if afraid of losing something important. And in the way she held the book, the way she gripped the cover with her fingers, as if clutching it in the hope that the words inside would keep it from falling, Trevor recognized himself, the old self. When she left, without noticing him, he went to the shelf and saw that someone had left a piece of paper next to his book. It was handwritten, "Thank you for not lying. Thank you for leaving the truth in every sentence. You gave me permission to be myself." Trevor took the piece of paper, put it in his pocket, but not as a trophy, but as a reminder, not of success, not of talent, but of responsibility. Because when you speak honestly, without embellishment, without hiding your pain, someone somewhere will feel that you are no longer alone. And that is the most that history can give. From that day on, he began to write less often, but more deeply. Not because there was nothing to talk about, but because now every word mattered. He no longer sought to keep up, to impress, to meet expectations. His new texts were quiet, like morning rain, the kind that don't thunder with headlines but leave imprints on the soul. He no longer ran away from himself. And he no longer sought himself in others. He simply was. Like a tree that had taken root after many years of storms. Sometimes, when he couldn't sleep, he would go out onto the balcony with a cup of tea. stare into the night, and remember the house he had once left. That house still stood. Somewhere out there, beyond the city, beyond the years, beyond memories. But he no longer had power over it. Now it was the place that had made him who he had become. Not a sentence, but a starting point. Trevor didn't go back there. But sometimes he wrote letters that he never sent. There was no anger in them. There was no reproach. Just a quiet gratitude for the fact that even in ruins, a desire to build can be born. And for the fact that even from wounds, strength can grow. His books began to appear on the shelves of teenagers, in the backpacks of travelers, on the bedside tables of people who had survived their own. They did not become bestsellers. But they became someone's lifebuoys. And that was more important. One day he received a letter from a guy from another state. It contained only a few words. I packed up and left. Thanks to you. I don't know what will happen next. But I know that I am worth more. And I believe in it for the first time. Trevor held the letter in his hands for a long time. Then he opened a new notebook. And wrote on the first page, sometimes one sentence is enough to change someone's life. But first, you have to dare to say it to yourself. And he wrote again. Not out of pain. Not from emptiness. But from fullness. From a place where everything gathered: losses, fears, love, faith, forgiveness, dreams. And each story began with the same words. He didn't become a hero. He became himself. And that was enough. Trevor woke up to the sound of the old alarm clock. He didn't rush to get up, he stayed in bed for a few more minutes, listening to the silence. Outside the window it was autumn, starting to paint the world in shades of yellow and brown. The leaves had already begun to fall, and even the city air had that freshness that comes from the transition from heat to cold. He got up and walked slowly to the kitchen, where a cup of tea was still hot from his evening tea on the table. There were many books on the shelves, old and new, read and unread. Trevor looked at them, but didn't pick up any. He felt like this moment was frozen in time. And he was just here, with no desire to rush anywhere. He washed himself, put on a warm sweater, and felt a peace he hadn't had before. It wasn't happiness, like in books or movies. It was inner silence. He was no longer afraid of being alone with himself. And even though he was 35, it seemed as if he had been waiting for this moment all this time, the moment when he would find himself in silence again. Trevor packed his things and went to the library. It was his usual route, steps along the street that was gradually becoming less crowded. The city was changing. Every year, more and more people disappeared into the everyday, concentrating on their own affairs, not noticing the little things. The library was quiet. Old shelves, nooks, and crannies where you could hide and read endlessly. Trevor usually came here not to find a new book, but simply to be among them. Among the words, among the thoughts that other people had left behind. He had long since given up on great ambitions, but sometimes, when he sat here, something inside him was a little restless. He still could not completely get out of his head the thought of how his path had changed, and whether he had really chosen the right direction. Today he had not found anything new that could interest him. He took a book from an old row that he had once considered for a long time, but had never finished reading. It was about simple things, about finding yourself in everyday life, when life seemed monotonous. He sat down in his usual place and opened the first page. The text was familiar, but the words were still important. Each chapter of this work reminded him of his own path. And although the author was completely different, his views, experiences, even the words seemed to reflect Trevor's own thoughts. He thought for a moment about how often he had read books to find answers to questions that had long since ceased to arise in his head. Now he knew, sometimes it is not the answers that are important, but the questions themselves. And the more questions, the more opportunities to understand who you really are. He reread what was on the last page again and realized that this book would not give him peace. It, like many others, was written for those who had not yet learned to accept themselves. But for Trevor it was different. He was no longer looking for answers. He was looking for peace within himself. In the evening he left the library, frozen again, but not from the cold, but from something else. From the fact that he began to understand more than before. The same streets, the same people, but everything he saw looked different. All these years he had been looking for himself in books, in stories, in the words of other people. And now, after everything that had happened, he understood, this was not a search, this was a return. At home, he sat down at his desk. He no longer wrote an attempt to escape from reality or fictional worlds. Now he wrote about what really happened. He no longer tried to hide his emotions, he did not try to change the past. He wrote as it was. And each new line was part of this process, the process of acceptance. That evening, he simply wrote. There was no great goal, no ambition, only words that poured onto the paper like water from a spring. And he felt how these words gradually, step by step, filled him with the feeling that all this was part of a great story. His story. He did not fight the past, he did not try to change it, but he was no longer afraid of it. And this was the first page of a new stage. Trevor got up and looked out the window, at the street that was slowly darkening under the cover of a night's sleep. He realized that all this was neither the end nor the beginning. This was just life. His life. And with each step he understood more and more, the most important thing is not to lose yourself in this world where everything changes so quickly. He went to bed and fell asleep peacefully, knowing that tomorrow would be the same day. Again, a day of searching, a day of understanding. But now it was not a burden. This was a new path, and he walked it without fear, without fuss, but with the awareness each new step brings you closer to the place where you can truly be yourself. The next morning, Trevor woke up earlier than usual. The sun had not yet had time to peek over the horizon, and there was a deep silence around. He got out of bed, taking his time, giving himself a few minutes to wake up calmly. All this time he felt the sounds of the waking world barely touching him. And each one was new. It was as if life was beginning again. He threw on a warm sweater, made a cup of tea, and sat by the window, looking at the gray, cloud-covered sky. It was the place where he often found peace, gazing at the immutability of the world, which seemed to be motionless, but at the same time changed with every breath he took. Life never stood still, even when everything seemed familiar and monotonous. Today he decided to go to the library again. But not for a book, but simply to be where his thoughts had their space. He felt like every step down the street was bringing him closer to that state when there was no need to look for anything. You just walk and feel that you are where you are supposed to be. He didn't yet fully understand what this place was, but he knew it existed. When he reached the library, it was warm and quiet inside. In fact, this place had always been that way to him, a haven for thought, a space for solitude, free from pressure and demands. Trevor took his time going to the bookshelves. Instead, he sat in a familiar spot by the window and just sat there, watching the sunlight gently filter through the panes. There were many people in this world who were looking for answers, in books, in people, in their past mistakes. And Trevor realized that none of that mattered. What mattered more was learning to be present in the moment that was unfolding right in front of you. He pulled out his notebook and began to write down whatever came to mind. He wasn't writing to create a masterpiece. He was writing simply to convey what he felt. His fingers glided across the paper, and with each movement, new words, new thoughts emerged. Meanwhile, the first snow had begun to fall outside the window. Light, almost invisible, it touched the ground, adding a magical feeling to the world. Trevor looked at this process as something natural, not needing explanation. Snow always had something magical about it. Not just cold, but cleansing, a new beginning. After a while, another man entered the library, an old acquaintance of Trevor's, whom they had often met on the same shelves. The man stopped by his desk, smiling. "Are you here often?" he asked. Trevor smiled back and nodded. "Not just often," he replied. "I'm not here looking, I just am." It seemed that this answer was one that he had been trying to find all his life. And even if he could not yet fully understand the full depth of this simple statement, he felt that each word was becoming more and more a part of his present. They talked for a few minutes about the past, about books, about the city, but there was no goal, no question to be solved. It was simply a meeting of two people who understood that life is not always made up of big answers, but sometimes just small moments. And it is these moments, so simple and insignificant at first glance, that make up the whole picture. When the man left, Trevor returned to his notebook. And he began to write again. As if each thought brought a new piece. He wrote about simple things, how his hand changed when he wrote, how his thoughts changed when he stopped rushing. About how he began to accept the world as it was, without wanting to change it. And even as evening began to envelop the city in darkness, Trevor did not rush to leave the library. He knew that he could always return, and that every day, every moment, was an opportunity for a new step. And that was enough to feel free. After escaping a toxic relationship with his parents, he finds a new path filled with a search for inner peace and true freedom.